And joining me now from Boston to look at these results in detail is Ravi Ramamurti, Distinguished Professor of International Business and the Director of the Center for Emerging Markets at Northeastern University. Ravi, good to see you.
Same here, Michelle.
Ravi, India's economy grew by 7.6% in 2015 to 2016. First quarter growth was at 7.9%, greater than analysts had predicted. How long can India sustain this growth momentum?
Well, I think India needs to do a little more than it already has. Prime Minister Modi came into office creating very high expectations. And the problem is that while he has a lot of good ideas and he himself is ready to move at a very quick pace, the country has to follow behind him. Otherwise, you don't really have change. And there are two problems there. The first problem is when you have a new idea, you have to enact it somehow in Parliament, and then you have to implement it on the ground in the various provinces. And that is where his plans run into some difficulties. He doesn't control the upper house of the Parliament, and therefore has not been able to get many of his reforms pushed through the legislative process. He doesn't control more than half the GDP in states which are run by other opposition parties. So he doesn't have a real handle on the implementation or the enactment of these reforms, and that is slowing him down. And the question is whether some of the states will pick up the ball and run with it in the future.
Well, Ravi, before we get down into Modi's reforms, there was tremendous growth, but there are a number of economists and analysts questioning the validity of this government data. There is an acknowledgement that, yes, India is growing fast, but that 7.9% number seems a little dodgy. And there are a lot of inconsistencies, like that manufacturing grew by 9.3% year over year last quarter. Industrial production, on the other hand, only rising 0.2% at the same time. Another big red flag is that growth in bank lending is near its slowest rate in a decade. So what do you think about the accuracy of this data overall?
Yeah, there is something, somehow there is not a match between what the numbers are telling us and what you're seeing on the ground in the economy. That is, for instance, one of the things you sort of indirectly touched on is the lack of confidence and optimism and enthusiasm on the part of the Indian private sector. Prime Minister Modi has been trying to attract foreign investment. But even before you do that, I think it's very important to get your own domestic private sector optimistic about the future, and you're not seeing that. So that is a cause for concern. The fall in exports is a cause for concern. And you can't blame the entire fall in exports just on the slowing of the global growth, because other countries are not seeing their exports fall off by 20 or 25% compared to the same time a year ago. And that is what is happening in the Indian case. The most worrying thing for me is that Indian growth appears to be jobless growth. You're not seeing the huge expansion in number of jobs that you need to see for a country with the population that India has, and with a youthful population, a lot of whom are entering the labor force looking for jobs and are not finding them the way they did about a decade ago when India was also growing at a high rate. So yes, there is something missing here.
Well, like you say, exports slowing down in India, but India has benefited from imports of oil. It is a net importer of oil, and it has done very well after that dramatic drop in crude oil prices. So what happens if oil starts to steady at $50 per barrel or goes even higher? What does that now mean for India?
Well, it will just make India's trade balance worse. I mean, the fundamental difference between China and India is that in China's growth phase, China got a kick from exports, from world trade. That is, it was exporting a lot more than it was importing, and that was helping to fuel GDP growth and create jobs within the economy. India is not getting a kick from world trade. It's actually being dragged back. Its growth is being held back by the fact that its exports are declining, and its imports, despite low oil prices, is still in a deficit if you look at manufactured goods. So what happens if the oil prices go up? I think the outlook for India becomes a little less appealing. So I think this is
Ravi,
something to be very concerned about.
Ravi, you mentioned China, and let's bring China in here, because India's finance minister said that with China slowing, the world was seeking other shoulders to rest growth on. So where does China fit into this picture? How can India and China now balance an economic partnership with competing goals?
Well, yes, China's slowdown is a a damper on the growth of all of Asia, and that includes India, because half of India's exports go to Asia, including China. And that has been one of the reasons for the slowdown in India's exports. But looking at the relationship between India and China, just between the two of them, as you know, there is a huge bilateral trade deficit in China's favor and against India. If they're doing about $60–70 billion worth of annual trade, of that $60 billion is going from China to India, and only about $10 billion is going from India to China. So one of the things that I think China has to work on is to turn this into more of a win-win relationship. And I think one way to do that is for Chinese companies to think of India as a long-term opportunity, be willing to invest in India to create more value added within India, which will also create more jobs within the Indian economy, and not simply look at it as a place to sell your exports.
Ravi, very quickly, Prime Minister Modi will be visiting the US again in June. What are your expectations from that visit?
I think it's going to be mainly a political visit. I think it's a chance for the Prime Minister Modi to seal some agreements with President Obama before the end of his term. I don't see many economic benefits coming out of this visit. If anything, my advice would be don't create any further expectations about the growth opportunities in India. Now it's time for India to deliver. Promising more at this stage would not be a good idea. I think it's time to be quiet and focus on the implementation and come back in a year or two when the facts speak for themselves and the investment is flowing in and the jobs are being created and the economy is booming.
Well, a lot of top CEOs courting India and Modi, Tim Cook being one of them. All right, thanks so much, Ravi Ramamurti, Professor of International Business and Director of the Center of Emerging Markets at Northeastern University.
If you like what you just saw, follow us on social media and visit our website, CCTV-America.com.